The air was crisp and cool as Jake, Lauren, Tom, and Emily piled out of their rental SUV, their breaths fogging in the early morning air. They had driven hours out into the remote, rugged mountains of Eastern Europe, eager for an adventure far from the well-trodden paths back home. The forest around them was dense and eerily quiet, with mist clinging to the trees like a ghostly veil. They had rented camping gear, studied the maps, and now, finally, they were ready to immerse themselves in nature. As they began to hike up the narrow trail, the excitement was palpable. Jake, ever the brave one, led the way, sharing local legends he'd heard about the mountains, whispered stories of ancient spirits, lost hikers, and shadows that lurked just out of sight. Lauren rolled her eyes, but there was a nervous laugh to her voice as she reminded him, "We came here to get away from people and to unplug, not to listen to ghost stories." A couple of hours into the hike, they reached a small clearing with an old moss-covered cabin at its edge. It looked abandoned, with its wooden beams rotting and vines clinging to the walls. The door was slightly ajar, creaking with the wind, shivered. "Guys, shouldn't we camp somewhere else?" But Jake's curiosity had already pulled him forward. "Come on, it's just an old shack. Besides, I bet no one's been up here in years. It's perfect." With a grin, he pushed open the door, revealing a dark interior, filled with shadows and the faint smell of damp wood. Inside, they found strange markings etched into the walls, circles and symbols that didn't seem to belong to any language they recognized. Emily hesitated in the doorway, a sense of unease washing over her. Maybe we should find a place farther up the mountain, somewhere less creepy. But it was late, and the sun was starting to sink behind the peaks. Reluctantly, they set up their tents just outside the cabin, figuring it was the safest place to spend the night. As darkness descended, an unsettling silence enveloped the forest. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just a thick, oppressive stillness. That night, as they huddled around the campfire, Jake continued with his tales, his voice dropping to a hushed tone. "The locals say that once you're deep enough in these mountains, something watches you. They call it the Watcher in the Mist. It only shows itself to those who wander too far off the path, and when it does, they're never seen again." Tom laughed it off, but there was a nervous edge in his voice. They exchanged uneasy glances, the flickering fire casting shadows that seemed to stretch and twist with every gust of wind. As they settled into their tents, each of them felt a creeping unease. But it was only when Emily awoke in the dead of night to a soft, whispering sound that the real terror began. She lay frozen, her breath shallow, straining to hear. The whispers grew louder, but they weren't in English. They sounded ancient, foreign, and they seemed to be calling her name. Shaking, Emily dared to peek outside her tent. The forest was cloaked in darkness, the only light coming from the faint embers of their dying fire. But in the distance, just at the edge of the clearing, she saw something. A tall, shadowy figure standing motionless, half hidden in the mist. Emily gasped, her heart pounding as the figure slowly turned toward her. She couldn't see a face, but she felt its gaze, cold and piercing, like fingers wrapping around her soul. She scrambled back into her tent, clutching her sleeping bag tightly, praying that whatever she'd seen would disappear. As dawn finally broke, Emily stepped outside, her face pale and hands trembling. She wanted to tell the others, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, she knew that their adventure had only just begun, and that something was waiting for them in the shadows. The next morning, Emily could barely eat. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her mind replaying the shadowy figure she had seen in the mist. But as the sun rose higher and the forest around them brightened, she started to wonder if her mind had just been playing tricks on her. She hesitated to tell the others, not wanting to seem paranoid. Tom, Jake, and Lauren, meanwhile, were in high spirits, excited to push farther up the mountain. The group continued their ascent, following an old, narrow trail that snaked through dense trees and rocky terrain. But as they climbed, the forest grew darker, with the sunlight struggling to break through the thick canopy. A strange, unsettling chill filled the air, even though it was midday. The trees seemed to close in, and the silence grew heavier, pressing down on them like a weight. After a few hours, they found themselves in a secluded glen, surrounded by twisted ancient trees covered in thick moss. Jake, who had been leading, paused and frowned. This wasn't on the map, or was it? He unfolded the worn trail map they'd brought, but the path they had taken seemed to vanish off the paper. Lauren laughed nervously. So, we're lost? But her voice lacked its usual confidence. Tom shrugged, though his expression was uncertain. Let's take a break. We'll figure it out. They set their bags down and rested, but as they sat in the eerie quiet, something odd happened. Emily's head jerked up as she heard it again, the faint, almost imperceptible whispers, like someone murmuring from deep within the forest. She glanced around, trying to catch the sound, but it seemed to fade the moment she focused on it. Did you guys hear that? Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jake and Lauren exchanged glances, but Tom nodded slowly. I thought I heard something? Voices? He looked uneasy, as if he didn't want to admit he'd heard anything at all. Lauren brushed it off with a forced laugh. Guys, it's just the wind or something. But as she spoke, the whispers returned, louder this time, drifting on the cold breeze. They weren't just voices, it was a language, strange, guttural, and ancient. None of them could make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. They were being watched. A shiver ran through the group, and they all instinctively huddled closer. Jake stood up abruptly. Let's get moving. Staying here is giving me the creeps. Reluctantly, they packed up and continued hiking. As they moved deeper into the woods, the whispers grew fainter, but their anxiety lingered, festering in the silence. The trail became harder to follow, twisting between gnarled roots and patches of thorny undergrowth. Shadows seemed to move at the edges of their vision, just out of sight, slipping away when they turned to look. By late afternoon, the sky was beginning to darken, and a dense fog crept through the trees, wrapping around them like a shroud. They pushed forward, desperate to find a place to set up camp before nightfall. As they turned a corner, they stumbled upon a large clearing. In the center stood a circle of ancient stones, each one covered in the same symbols they had seen in the abandoned cabin. The stones radiated an unearthly chill, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Emily's stomach twisted. I don't think we should be here. But Jake, ever the adventurer, approached the stones. It's just a campsite, Em. It's a perfect spot to set up for the night. He dropped his pack near one of the stones, glancing at the strange carvings with a mixture of fascination and unease. They reluctantly agreed and pitched their tents, each of them glancing nervously at the stones as they worked. As darkness fell, they gathered around a small fire, the light casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch toward the stone circle. Jake tried to lighten the mood, cracking jokes and passing around their last few energy bars, but no one laughed. The forest felt alive around them, as if it were waiting, watching. And then, just as the fire crackled and spat, they heard it, a deep, low humming, like a chant coming from the stones themselves. Emily's heart pounded as she clutched her jacket, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The humming grew louder, reverberating through the clearing, and then she saw them. Pale figures, translucent, ghostly, slowly emerging from the mist around the stones. Their faces were obscured, but their mouths moved in sync, chanting in that same strange, ancient language. The group froze, too terrified to move. The figures swayed and chanted, their voices blending with the whispers that seemed to rise from the very ground. As the figures moved closer, they could make out hollow, empty eyes that seemed to pierce through them. Jake swallowed, his voice shaking. Run. Without another word, they grabbed their bags and bolted from the clearing, plunging into the dark forest, stumbling and tripping over roots and rocks. The chanting followed them, echoing through the trees as the ghostly figures drifted behind, relentless and silent. By the time they stopped, gasping for breath, they realized they were lost, deeper in the woods than they had ever planned to go. The chanting had faded, but the terror lingered, sinking into their bones. Tom's voice was barely a whisper. What were those things? No one had an answer. They were alone in the dark, surrounded by shadows and whispers. And deep down they all knew one thing. Whatever they had disturbed in those woods wasn't finished with them yet. They huddled close together, too afraid to set up camp, and too exhausted to go any farther into the dark, silent forest. The mist grew denser, swirling around their feet and chilling them to the bone. They took turns keeping watch, but none of them dared to close their eyes for long. Every rustle, every whisper of wind seemed to carry something sinister with it. As dawn finally broke, it cast an eerie, muted light over the forest, barely cutting through the mist. They gathered what little courage they had left and continued onward, hoping to find a trail or any sign of civilization. But with every step, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, like eyes lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment. After an hour of walking, they stumbled upon another odd sight, a small, dilapidated cabin, partially hidden among the trees. The roof sagged, and the walls were covered in dark, twisting vines. Despite their fear, they felt compelled to approach it. Something about it called to them, as if it held answers to the terror they had experienced. Jake cautiously pushed open the door, the wood creaking loudly in the silence. Inside, the cabin was dark and filled with a thick, stale smell. Dust hung in the air, and strange, claw-like marks covered the walls. In the middle of the room stood a table with a worn, leather-bound book resting on it. Do we dare look inside?" whispered Lauren, her voice barely audible. Tom nodded, though his face was pale. They approached the book together, flipping it open to the first page. The text was written in a language they didn't recognize, but the symbols were similar to those they had seen on the stones in the clearing. Emily traced a finger along the strange text, her hands trembling. "This has to be connected to what we saw last night, those figures, the chanting." Lauren flipped through the pages, stopping at a crude drawing that made them all recoil in horror. It depicted shadowy figures standing around the stone circle, chanting as they held their hands up to the sky. At the center of the circle, a dark, monstrous figure loomed, a creature with hollow eyes and twisted limbs. I think they were performing some sort of ritual," Emily whispered, unable to tear her eyes from the drawing. "Those spirits weren't just lost souls, they were guardians, protectors of something dark." They stared at each other, each of them struggling to comprehend what they had stumbled upon. But before they could discuss it further, the air in the cabin turned icy cold. A sudden, intense feeling of dread washed over them, as if something ancient and malevolent had just awakened. Tom backed away from the book, his breath fogging in the frigid air. We need to get out of here, now." They bolted out of the cabin, running as fast as they could through the mist-shrouded forest. But no matter how far they went, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Shadows flitted between the trees, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. Then, without warning, Jake stumbled and fell to the ground, clutching his ankle in pain. The others stopped, gathering around him in panic. "I think I twisted it," he groaned, wincing. Lauren knelt beside him, looking around with wide, terrified eyes. "We have to keep moving. Can you walk at all?" Jake gritted his teeth and nodded, trying to stand with their help. But just as they began to move, the mist parted, revealing a figure standing not far from them. It was one of the ghostly apparitions they had seen in the clearing, its hollow eyes fixed on them with a cold, unyielding stare. The figure raised a skeletal hand, and a low, guttural voice echoed through the forest. They couldn't understand the words, but the intent was clear. It was a warning, a command to leave, or suffer the consequences. Panicked, they half-carried, half-dragged Jake through the forest, moving as quickly as they could. But as they struggled onward, the apparitions appeared one by one, blocking their path, their voices blending into a menacing chant that seemed to seep into their very bones. Just when they thought they couldn't go any farther, they stumbled into another clearing. But this one was different. At the center was an ancient, rotting tree with twisted branches that seemed to reach toward them like claws. Strange symbols were carved into its bark, matching the ones they had seen in the cabin and on the stones. Emily gasped, realization dawning on her face. This is the source. This is what the Guardians were trying to protect. The others looked at her, confusion and fear etched on their faces. "What do you mean?" Tom asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know how I know," Emily whispered, her voice barely a breath. "But this tree, it's like a portal, a gateway, and the spirits were trying to keep it sealed." As if in response, the ground beneath them began to tremble, and a deep, unnatural groan emanated from the tree. Dark mist poured from its roots, swirling around them, and the apparitions closed in, their faces twisted with anguish and fury. They were trapped, surrounded by forces beyond their understanding. The Guardians' whispers grew louder, filling their minds with fear and despair. And as they stood frozen in terror, the dark mist began to take shape, forming a towering, monstrous figure, the same creature they had seen in the cabin's drawing. Its hollow eyes bore into them, and a cruel, twisted smile spread across its face as it raised a clawed hand, beckoning them forward. Jake's voice cracked with terror. We have to destroy it. It's the only way to break free." But how? They had no weapons, no means of fighting back against a being that was more shadow than flesh. And as the creature advanced, its laughter echoing through the clearing, they realized that this was only the beginning. The true horror had just begun. They stood frozen, helpless, as the monstrous shadow creature towered above them, its twisted limbs reaching out like talons. The mist around the ancient tree thickened, coiling around their legs, rooting them to the ground. Each of them could feel the creature's presence seep into their minds, a creeping, malevolent force that whispered promises of terror and despair. Emily took a shaky breath, her gaze fixed on the rotting tree. "If that tree is a portal, maybe we can close it." "But how?" Tom asked, panic in his eyes. "We don't have anything to fight this thing." She looked around, her heart racing. Her eyes landed on the strange symbols carved into the bark of the tree, the same markings they'd seen on the stones and in the cabin's book. She realized those symbols weren't just decoration. They were binding marks, placed there by the spirits who had once guarded this place. "The symbols, they're a seal," she whispered urgently. "We need to finish the ritual, complete the seal. If we do, maybe we can trap it." Lauren looked doubtful, but desperation gave her a glimmer of hope. "What do we have to lose?" The creature sensed their plan, and its laughter turned to a low, guttural growl. Shadows shifted around it, stretching toward them, but the apparitions they had seen earlier stepped forward, blocking its path. Though faint and barely visible, these spirit guardians formed a barrier, buying them precious moments. Jake hobbled to the edge of the clearing, using a branch for support. He pointed toward the cabin. "The book. We need to go back and see the symbols we missed." Tom hesitated, glancing at the shadow creature with dread, but he knew this might be their only chance. "Stay here," he said to the others. "Keep that thing distracted." He turned and sprinted back through the mist toward the cabin. Inside, the air was thick with dust and shadows. Tom flipped through the book, trying to recall the sequence of symbols they had seen. After a few tense moments, he found a page with the symbols drawn in a circular formation. At the center was a crude depiction of the twisted tree. His eyes widened. He understood now. These symbols had to be carved around the tree, sealing it from all sides. Clutching the book, he raced back to the others. "We have to draw these symbols around the tree," he panted, showing them the page. "It's the only way." They split up, each of them using anything they could find, a stone, a broken twig, to carve the symbols into the ground in a circle around the tree. As they worked, the spirit guardians flickered and faded, their energy draining as they struggled to hold the creature back. The creature lunged forward, forcing the spirits to retreat. Its hollow eyes burned with fury, and its clawed hands stretched toward Lauren, who was working frantically to finish her part of the seal. She felt a chill run through her spine as the creature's fingers brushed her shoulder, sending icy pain down her arm. "Lauren, move!" Jake shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her out of the creature's reach. They fell to the ground just as Emily finished the final symbol, connecting the circle. For a heartbeat, everything went still. Then the ground trembled, and the tree began to shake violently. The mist thickened, swirling around the tree, wrapping it in a dense, impenetrable fog. The shadow creature roared in fury, clawing at the mist as it was pulled toward the tree, forced back by the seal. "No!" reeked, its voice a twisted, agonizing wail that echoed through the forest. The guardians reappeared, their forms stronger and more defined than before. They surrounded the creature, pushing it back, binding it to the tree. One by one, the spirits placed their hands on the symbols, strengthening the seal. With a final furious scream, the creature was sucked into the tree, vanishing into the gnarled wood. The mist cleared, the air stilled, and a heavy silence fell over the forest. The spirit guardians looked at the group, nodding in silent gratitude before fading away, their task finally complete. The group stumbled back, stunned, barely able to comprehend what had just happened. The tree stood silent, a scarred relic of the nightmare they had survived. Is it over? Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. Emily nodded, though she couldn't shake the lingering feeling of dread. I think so. We've sealed it. They walked back to their campsite, numb and exhausted, and gathered their belongings in silence. As they hiked down the mountain, the oppressive feeling of the forest gradually lifted, replaced by the warmth of daylight breaking through the trees. They finally reached the trailhead, each of them breathing a sigh of relief. But as they piled into their car, ready to leave the mountain behind, Emily turned for one last look. In the distance, she thought she saw a figure, a faint silhouette standing among the trees, watching them. She blinked, and it was gone. They drove away in silence, each of them haunted by memories of the shadowed forest and the spirit guardians. And though they tried to convince themselves it was truly over, they couldn't shake the feeling that the ancient force they had encountered still lingered, waiting for the next unlucky soul to disturb its eternal slumber.